It's a beautiful, beautiful place. But there's a strange disconnect. You know, on one side, the hook-shaped island, but then you have a lot of plane wrecks just sprinkled through this sort of green Bahamian jungle. And most mysterious of all is this giant, literally a giant plane, sitting out there right in the middle of the harbor.
We're going down 70 feet. And I didn't anticipate a series of these things continuing north. What the hell is going on? What about a brave new world down there, right? How do we find these things? How do we get into these things?
Violent crime is soaring, and governments are powerless to stop it.
It was considered the most sophisticated form of drug trafficking lawmen had ever seen.
Not like any other type of investigation. It requires you to think outside the box. But it's how far can we go?
My name is Sidney Kirkpatrick. I'm a true crime writer. It's what I've always done. That's the only job I've ever had, is writing true crime. I love unraveling mysteries. And then I stumbled on this story, and boy, I literally dropped down the rabbit hole. It was around 1984. My uncle's best friend in Florida had his yacht ripped off. And we chartered a small plane and just went looking for it. There was this particular island, Norman's Cay, in this chain of islands called the Exumas. It's a beautiful hook-shaped island, maybe 7 miles long. And people told us, if you want to go looking for this boat, that's a good stop-off place. We didn't see the boat, but there was a giant plane sitting out there right in the middle of the harbor. We'd heard little things, odd things about this island. So we decided to land and start asking questions. You had 10, 12 little homes right off the beaches, just really beautiful. Somebody had built these wonderful vacation homes. But where were the vacationers? You know, they were gone. There were burned buildings, wrecked planes, literally everywhere. Just sprinkled through this sort of green Bahamian jungle. And of course, most mysterious of all is this giant plane sitting out there right in the middle of the harbor. It's an unusual plane to find that crashed on the island. You know, what happened to this plane? Something rather serious had taken place here. And then suddenly, you know, these Jeeps come right down to where we parked. And guys with guns, and all of a sudden we knew we were into something. They told us to turn around and leave. And, you know, we didn't put up an argument. It caught on my radar screen. You know, who were these people? Why were we turned around on this little island? and what was going on with this giant plane. As I dug deeper into the history of this island, it was just a known place where smugglers operated. It's close enough to Florida that you can hop right across, the Florida Strait undetected. There had been talk at one time it had been used by pirates. And unfortunately, most of the island residents were not happy or willing to talk about what happened. I kept hearing, one man's name, Richard Novak. Yeah, they used to call him the professor. And they kept saying, well, he'll tell you, what went on this island if you can find him. And eventually I knocked on the door of a modest clapboard home. Door opened a crack and somebody pointed a pistol at me. It was this Richard Novak, and he was still scared. He was still looking over his shoulder.
Eight, 9, 10.
We sat down together and started conducting tape-recorded interviews.
Hello, I'm Richard Novak. I taught a course in water photography.
He was a college professor and a professional scuba diver. Richard had 5 children, and all of them, had been taught to scuba dive very early on.
His life was raising the family, all 5 of us kids. So he was always in escape mode. He always wanted to get away and do something. And I love flying, so I became a pilot. So he enlisted me to get a plane. We moved his gear from place to place to place.
During the summer of 1978, I decided to fly to Norman's Cay in Exuma to see what the diving was like there.
He found this incredible little island, Norman's Cay. And he just fell in love with it instantly. Richard had this dream of an island he could call his own, where he'd have a marine science center and he could bring his 5 children who would come and live on this island.
I think the whole thing on Norman's Cay started when I was 9. He went away every summer, so we were kind of used to him being gone during that time. He was always looking for a new adventure. Norman's Cay was just a good place for him to be.
Was this dream realistic or not? I don't know. But in his own mind, it was. And then, of course, he ran into the man who he thought offered that.
I am a pilot, an airline pilot. And in the late 1970s, I was running a taxi company called Trans Island Airways. And then one day, a man walked up, beautifully dressed in a tan suit, well-spoken, well-groomed, handsome. He said his name was Joe Lader, that he'd just bought Norman's Cay.
Thank you, Mr. Lader. Enjoy your flight.
And he wanted me to take him there. And we flew, and he told me that, he was planning to expand the hotel and really make it a top-notch tourist resort in the Bahamas. I believed him.
Joe introduced himself to Richard, and he heard Richard's dream. Here was somebody who appeared to have the money to make Richard's dreams come true. He was the owner of several airline rental companies in Florida, and they would rent and they would refurbish planes. He was quite successful at it, apparently. It was quite lucrative. And of course, that raises the question, where did this plane that was crashed in the harbor figure into the mix? Joe was in that business.
When we first arrived there, we went and we flew all over the island, and he was pointing out these things to me. I remember seeing the plane.
People would give us rides out there, and then we would snorkel on it. We'd go in the back door and then go through the entire length of the plane and then come out the front. It was just so interesting to be able to snorkel on a plane wreck.
I've seen it many times from the air, quite a few times from the sea. It had always intrigued me, and I always wondered how it came to be there. So the first question was, what kind of plane was it? It was obvious that it was a cargo plane, and I'm not sure what its capacity was, but it was 6-7 tons. From the shape of the nose and the cockpit, it was obvious that it was a C-46. C-46 was a World War II cargo carrier. But it is so rotted away today that there are no obvious clues to what it was being used for or why it had crashed. Was this just a plane that Joe had used for his aircraft rental company? Or was there something darker going on? One day, a few months after Joe arrived, I got a call from Norman's Key. People we had dropped the day before, they were desperate to leave. You could hear it in their voices. And they explained that Joe latest employees had a big party in the neighboring villa the night before. It literally went on all night. And they had gone over to ask them to be quiet and learned very quickly you don't ask these people to do anything. They were met by thugs wielding guns. It was obvious that they were trying to get them to leave. We didn't realize it was changing, but it definitely was changing.
A crane was brought onto the island. Bulldozers were brought on the island. Airplane hangars started to be built. The runway was repaved. A lot of money, a lot of supplies, building materials, heavy equipment were coming to the island. And yet, where were the tourists?
As time went by, as I look back now, I became quite suspicious. Something kept telling me that this was not the place to do what I wanted to do. I'd be off the key. They didn't want to make it easy for me to be there.
Richard lived in a little cottage that was right near the airstrip.
This is my home in Norman's Key, Bahamas.
He would make videos. His videos were motivated by places that he'd visited. He would talk about where he went and what he encountered.
This is the airstrip, but I used to watch the airplanes arriving.
It was not unusual for new planes to be arriving and leaving all the time on Norman's Cay. And I think Richard began suspecting that all was not good with this. And so he started an inventory on tail numbers. Long lists of them. He kept a diary book. And then there was one night. Novak was wide awake. You'd hear the plane coming in, a plane seriously in distress. So Novak immediately ran out on his porch behind the cottage. And he could see immediately this plane was coming in too fast, too low, and it crashed. Big fireball behind the plane hangar. Alarm bells were going off. Oh my God. He went out to investigate, and the pilot is certainly dead. There were parts of plane literally everywhere. And what's spread across the ground? Drugs. Bags of, kilos of cocaine. Suddenly, there was no question in his mind of what was taking place on this island. And his dream was shattered on Norman's Cay. So, of course, an even bigger question is what was going on with that great big C-46 that crashed in the harbor? Was that the mother lode ship carrying in the massive drugs? Tons of cocaine, not just a small shipment, but a massive shipment. Was that why it crashed?
Perhaps the pilot couldn't fly the plane properly because the plane was overloaded, so that it could not land safely on the runway. That would be the logical assumption. So I went back to the wreck to take a closer look. One of the propellers was badly damaged. Beneath the wings, the left engine is definitely damaged. On the right, there was very little damage. It was all concentrated on the left. Left landing gear was badly damaged. Cargo deck shows no sign of being buckled or ruptured, as it would if there had been a lot of cargo on board. And these photographs, taken soon after the crash, show the airframe is largely intact. This is not the wreck of a plane that had crashed with 7 tons of cargo on it. When this plane crash landed here, it was empty. Why would a cargo plane fly empty into Norman's Cay? It doesn't make sense.
I got a call from this agent to meet him downtown at one of the hotels.
As Richard told the story, he said as soon as he realized that illicit drug smuggling was going on this island, he turned to the DEA.
I knew from what this guy said when he called me, it was very important that I get to see him.
He would come to Nassau regularly. We certainly didn't want him walking into the embassy. So I recall meeting him in one of the pubs.
They gave all the dates of the planes that were coming in and flying out from Norman's Cay. A lot of the drug movements were going on at that time.
He was watching the flights coming in at night and weird comings and goings. He saw activity at the airstrip that only a fool wouldn't believe what it was. He was frustrated as far as I remember. When are you guys going to do something?
It was unsafe for him to go to Norman's Cay after that. But he had this connection with the island. And he just kept going back.
Novak was against drugs. If the police weren't going to stand up for this, he was. And oh my God, he was making himself a target, and his life was now in danger.
One time we were again going to go to Norman's Cay. I was interested in seeing more of the island. In the process of walking around, his van pulls up. These people show up with guns. They weren't very friendly.
They told Richard and Christopher they had to get off the island right this minute, right now, or they were going to be killed.
I turn the master switches on, and as soon as that happens, the fuel tank gauges go to empty. There's this big puddle of fuel out onto the ground. And then these people are saying, "Get going, get going."
They had enough to get off the runway, but after that, there was no place to come down.
So I make the decision to stay in climb mode. I was using almost max power to get up to altitude, because altitude is key. I climb up to as high as I can, knowing that at least I'll have some point of being able to glide to where we might want to land. So I climb up, climb up, climb up. Closest island is Rock Sound. It's a small airport. And we had to see where we were. I mean, there's no navigation aid. All we had was a compass and looking out the window, and the engine quit. So I know there's actually residual fuel that remains in the tank, where if you tip the plane 30 degrees, you can get to that residual fuel. So that's what I'm doing. I'm basically doing shallow circles. Until this tank ran dry, and then I did a shallow circle until this tank ran dry. And then when the engine quit, I saw where the runway was. I landed with no engine, and we coasted to a stop.
They kept calm, and that's certainly what kept them both alive. With the plane incident, for Richard, that was a declaration of war. It was Richard against Joe later. I mean, he wasn't going to walk away from this one. He was a fearless guy.
Eagle eyes, I'm there all alone now, and here I am sleeping with a cutlass in one hand and the 357 in the other hand, waiting for something to happen. And it did happen.
There was one night in particular which Richard remembered because he couldn't sleep because of the activity going on in the airstrip. They had cars on either side of the airstrip itself with their headlights on. One plane would land and then another would land, and they'd turn around and they'd be serviced. And it was almost like this conveyor belt of planes taken off. And you know, in one night, 5, 10, 15 planes were coming and going from Norman's Cay. He finally came to understand how big the drug smuggling operation was, the grand scale of what was taking place on this island. It was essentially two different airline companies. You had one company, planes bringing the drugs up from Colombia to Norman's Cay, and then you had the second airline of small planes, empty, flying in from the States, loading up, and then flying back out. And Norman's was the hub. That was the point at which those two, you know, separate operations came together. So the operation suddenly started making sense, and you could see suddenly where this C-46 figured in the picture.
This plane was coming to Norman's Cay, not to bring drugs, but just to pick up drugs. Suddenly, it made sense, it was logical. But there was one final question. We still wondered why it had crashed.
Richard was, of course, very interested in the C-46. He kept a diary book of events that were taking place. He was able to piece the story together, and so, as we now understand, they were running a test flight. And they had, you know, the plane up and running, and Joe was apparently pushing them forward to get this underway. He had debts to pay, he had obligations to fulfill. They needed the C-46 in operation. They made a premature run. The storm had filled up the front of the runway with sand. Unfortunately, it was the exact same color as the runway itself. So the pilot and then co-pilot, what they thought was the front of the runway was just a big berm of sand. And that's what they hit. The left wheel collapsed under the plane. The propeller hit the runway, and then the pilots trying to save themselves, save the plane. It would have dipped up over the side of the airplane hangars and then splashed down right into the harbor.
Now, there is a romantic story that these pilots were great. They were not. Started using a lot of high-powered cocaine, probably not making rational decisions. So these pilots that everybody was romanticized as being really super great guys. They really weren't.
The man Richard Novak knew simply as Joe turned out to be a key member of the Medellin drug cartel, the infamous Carlos Lederer. Pablo Escobar, the head of that cartel, was in charge. Carlos Lederer's contribution was head of transportation. He was the conduit by which large amounts of drugs could leave Colombia and get to the United States. And Richard put himself out on the line, stop this. This is more than a story of one man's war. This is almost a biblical parable of standing up for what you believe in and holding your ground.
Everybody was chasing these people, and it just became untenable for the smugglers. And that's what knocked down the Caribbean as an easy place to bring drugs in. And it moved it all to the land border in Mexico.
In the late 80s, U.S. Customs agents picked up on some strange activity on the Mexican border, which led them to an incredible discovery. There were a number of new warehouses coming up on the U.S. side of the border, and there didn't really seem to be any particular reason for them. And they observed a suspicious vehicle leave one of the warehouses. They pulled the vehicle over, and inside of the vehicle, they found a significant amount of narcotics. But when the customs agents went inside the warehouse, they had seen this grate. When they opened up the drain, they saw a vertical shaft, which connected to something none of them expected.
A sophisticated clandestine tunnel was unearthed last night by lawmen on both sides of the border. The 200-foot tunnel goes from a house in Agua Prieta to a warehouse in Douglas, Arizona.
When they entered the property in Agua Prieta, they didn't see any particular exit point for that tunnel. During the search, an agent went outside and turned the spigot. In the middle of the room, a pool table immediately started rising. And when they looked underneath that pool table, they saw a pneumatic lift and the entrance to the tunnel.
So that was the genesis of the tunnel threat as we know it today.
The Sinaloa cartel, they're always trying to figure out what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how to beat us. There was an area in Otay Mesa that intelligence and investigations had been watching for some time. And so we decided that we needed to investigate it further. Intelligence was unclear as to where the entrance and exit of this tunnel was.
And certain technologies that I can't really say I'm not at liberty to discuss at this time kind of created a consensus on where this X on the ground is going to be.
We know there's a tunnel there. We don't know how deep. So then we start drilling.
If you do hit a tunnel, you normally bring up lumber, wire, rails, any materials that they actually use to build the tunnel.
So those are the things that we look for as the drill comes up. Did we hit it or not?
Several times we noticed that we were being watched from Mexico. People would sit in the car all day taking notes on what we were doing.
So they were watching us, and we kind of picked up on it over time.
We completed 8 holes down to 60 feet and didn't find anything.
What do we do next? Where do we go next? Where do we move? Do we go to the east, the west? Are we deep enough?
So we made the call to actually go deeper.
How deep is he already? About 10 feet?
In our target area, we just kind of went left to right again and began drilling down to 80 feet. This was the deepest we'd ever drilled to find a tunnel.
Doubts were creeping into everybody's head. We knew there was a pretty good possibility that this was below the existing water table.
And all of a sudden, the drill operator actually looked at us, and we looked at him, and we knew right away he'd found something.
Think we got one.
The bull camera went down right away. And when we looked at the screen, we were confused. We could see what looked to be 4 plywood walls and 2 PVC pipes with water pouring out of them. All we saw at that time was a room full of water.
We didn't have any idea what the hell we hit. What we soon found out is something none of us anticipated was going on.
The story of Narcotics was actually very personal to me, because my stepson died as a result of a fentanyl overdose. And it was in his bedroom. You know, his grandmother was in the house at the time. They had no idea. I know that these tunnels are used to move fentanyl into the United States. He bought something from somebody. It immediately killed him. And he died right there. I think that day I finally understood the devastation it has on families and what that does to people. Every time we find one of these tunnels, we're helping to save some family from the same tragic loss. Once the tunnel was breached, the next morning there was a property on the south side of the border. Everybody and everything vacated the property. They knew we'd found them, and it revealed the entrance to the south. But we still needed to know how far north it stretched into the US, and the only way to answer that was for somebody to enter into the tunnel, because they're gonna have to map it. So we decided to drill a new shaft near the flooded room so that we could get our team into the tunnel.
Each tunnel, you're entering the unknown. Require you to think outside the box.
We got lowered down first, make sure there's not any threats.
We're going down 70 feet. Half of it's going to be full of water.
Top side, copy.
Over, top side. All 3 present and accounted for at the entrance. Stand by.
We drop in, we start making our way through the tunnel, and it's very narrow. It's in some cases only 20 inches wide. The bottom of the tunnel had rail on it for a cart. We noticed that
the rail bridges across an open hole in the floor of the tunnel. And as we come up to this hole in the floor, we look down and we see basically a pool with crystal clear water in it. The room that we hit with our drill. Strange for sure.
Why was there a big pool of water underneath the tunnel?
Now our job is to map it in order to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, you guys are clear to start mapping.
Copy.
As the team travels north, we track their progress from the surface.
120 feet, 20 degrees.
As we move through the tunnel, we try to call out compass headings and distances.
Okay, copy that. I'm shooting about 140 degrees. Go ahead and come up to my position and we'll go from there.
Hey, you copy? I'll pick you guys up. Standing by for next coordinates. Once I reach their location, my receiver will pick up a reading. I know I'm right on top of it. So at good location as we went north. 75 feet, 30 degrees. Copy.
Tracking them north, none of us could have predicted what lay ahead. As we went further into the U.S. from the first flooded room, there beneath the tracks, about 100 yards further on, was the second flooded room. And another 100 yards on, a third room.
And I didn't anticipate a series of these things continuing north inside the tunnel itself.
3 flooded rooms, with water flowing between them.
Why is the water flowing in this tunnel like that?
Then they realized what it was. Because each flooded room was higher than the last, the water was draining downhill to the south.
The tunnel was at the water table, so in order to get rid of the water, they had to dig a reservoir below the tunnel so that the water would gravity drain into the reservoir so they could pump it out. And it explained everything to us because we actually did not drill into the tunnel proper. We drilled into this reservoir. So that was the 4 walls we were seeing, and that's why it filled up with water so quick. It's unique and unusual to anything we've ever seen. We were countering one problem at a time and trying to figure out where it went. But we still don't know if this tunnel has an exit point in the United States. We're making our way, and then we noticed the ceiling kept getting higher and higher, which is great for me because I can stand upright. I'm tired of hunching over at this point. But we didn't have any idea of why the ceiling kept getting higher and higher.
What it made for was a spectacular effect. And to see that and to walk through it, it's just indescribable.
We look up, and up above us is about 20, 30 feet high where the dirt's gone. So we have this big room underground, and again, it's a new experience. We've never seen that before.
And that's where the second part of the mystery really took hold.
Why was the ceiling getting higher and higher?
Yeah, 20.802, zeros, geology stable.
Copy that.
We got to where that vault high ceiling area ended, and at that point it was about 600 feet in, and our air monitors alerted us to low oxygen.
Everything was fighting us. How do you get sufficient oxygen into a space that far down below, that long?
As the air quality deteriorates, you have to pump fresh air in there before you can keep moving forward.
So we knew we were getting close. The air was getting very difficult to push towards that last 100-yard stretch.
We finally made it to the end of where we could physically go and found that it was incomplete and there was a cart that was filled with bags of dirt that they were in the process of moving back to Mexico, probably the day of when we drilled into this tunnel.
It turned out that the tunnel had never been finished. But what amazed us was that instead of a single exit on the US side, it had 3 attempted exit points. It was only when we got to the end and saw these multiple exit attempts that the high ceilings finally made sense.
You know, actually, we're coming up, whatever that target was. For some reason, just didn't follow through. So they excavated everything back down to the floor, which left a 30 to 32-foot void ceiling, essentially.
So what we figured out that room actually was a mistake. It explained everything to us, why the ceiling kept getting higher and higher.
They continued digging north. They got to an exit point. They had some issues with that exit point, and then backed out again and started for a 3rd exit point,
which was stopped when we discovered them. Each time they tried to dig an exit point, it didn't work for some reason. This forced them to dig further north into the US than anyone had before. We could finally piece together how it would have worked.
The cartel would have moved narcotics up from southern Mexico up to the border. They would have taken them into the property on the Mexican side of the tunnel. They would have loaded them up into the elevator, descended in that elevator down to the bottom of the tunnel, loaded the narcotics onto the cart that was down there, and they would have driven that cart across the border to the US side.
An excavated part of the tunnel below the tunnel itself was used exclusively to cool water in order to pump it out further south.
The amount of work involved in doing that must be incredible.
But that's the price for digging a tunnel below the water table.
The cart itself was motorized. That was probably the only tunnel I've been in where I have confidence that that automated cart could have made it from one end to the other.
This ended up being the longest tunnel ever found at 4,309 feet, which is almost a mile long.
It really changed our perspective of the tunneling thread of how far these tunnels could go from the border.
The cartel regularly reuses open pieces of the tunnel on the Mexican side to create new tunnels on the US side. Our goal is to fill the entire tunnel with concrete so that it can't be reused.
They're not going to stop. They're working on another tunnel.
And they won't stop doing it. It's too valuable.
What we do is the best we can do to address the problem, but at the end of the day, it's a cultural problem that isn't easily solved.
I don't have an expectation in my lifetime that the demand for this is going to disappear, but I think that the work we do will help mitigate the problem and hopefully reduce the number of families exposed to these dangerous narcotics.